Hello. In this video, I'm going to start off our unit on memory. And we're going to go through, like usual, a lot of different aspects of our topic. And memory can be broken up into short and long-term memory. So we'll talk about the differences there. But there are also a lot of other distinctions between types of memories. We'll talk a little bit about strategies for remembering that, are relevant to people trying to learn different things, of course. We'll talk a little bit about procedural or implicit memories that are sort of different from the usual memories that we think about. And we'll talk a little bit about forgetting as well, and things like repressed memories. When I start this unit, I like to try to drive home the importance of studying memory and all of the processes involved, because it should be obvious that memory is important to human behavior and functioning and survival. It's how we remember the things that we've learned and how we have access to the information that makes us us, more or less. But it also has some more complex effects. So I do like to start out just by talking a little bit about an area of research, again, that I'm involved in that has to do with something called the cross-race or other race effect in eyewitness identification. So, as you may or may not know, people's memories are much more subjective and less reliable than we like to think. We're constantly reconstructing the experiences that we've had from the patterns of neural activation in our brains, and it doesn't make exact copies. It's not like opening a file on a computer. It's like reconstructing a scene in your head or pulling together pieces of a fact. And this relates to our ability to recognize faces because again you're kind of reconstructing a face as you're trying to remember it. It's not just like opening a picture or looking at a picture. And we generally, as human beings, have difficulty recognizing other people's faces, and that's something that's involved in eyewitness identification, of course. Taking a picture of a suspect or a lineup, for example, and trying to tell authorities if a person in the lineup or in the pictures was a person that you allege committed some kind of crime. And I think this is really useful to show how processes that shouldn't really matter to memory can affect it. So there is a famous meta-analysis by Christian Meisner and a colleague who a meta-analysis is when you combine lots and lots of different studies. So for decades, people had been studying this cross-race effect, and these researchers took all those studies and combined them into a single analysis to try to estimate the real effect size of this cross-race effect. And what I mean by the cross-race effect is that people are worse at recognizing faces from other races compared to the race that they identify with. So people are almost 1.5 times as likely to correctly identify same race faces. So if you think back to sensation and perception, we were talking about signal detection, right? That you can make correct identifications or correct rejections. Those are correct decisions, but you can also make mistakes. So these correct IDs are like the correct uh, decisions to say that was the person. So that's affected by race. But also, one of the types of mistakes is really heavily affected by race. Falsely IDing, so a false alarm of saying that a person committed a crime when they were not that person. And that is over 1.5 times more likely that you falsely ID somebody of a different race than your own. And this is a really robust finding that it is difficult to get rid of this, and it probably has to do with a lot of things like how much contact we have with people from other races and how much practice then we have encoding their faces. Because you might think about our ability to categorize and think of things in broad groups. And for the most part, that really helps us. When you look at a table or a chair or a tree, not all the trees and tables that you see look the same, but you know that they fit into the general category. So that helps you not have to like engage in bottom up processing all the time and have to like say, okay, this has 4 legs, it has a flat top, it appears that people are eating at it. Ah, yes, that's a table. So you can just do that, recognize it. But when it comes to recognizing people, those categorization processes can sometimes undermine our ability to properly recognize someone. So with faces that you have a less experience recognizing, you might categorize those people rather than really individuate them and think about their characteristics. You'll just think about the things that might stereotypically look to you like somebody with that skin color. So that might get in the way of you being able to remember their face properly. And I have the research that I'm involved in has been showing that not only is this like a pervasive thing that people make mistakes with on average, but people's racial attitudes, their implicit and explicit racial attitudes, tend to predict the likelihood that they're going to make those kinds of false identifications. So, you would like to think probably that your level of racial bias is separate from your ability to remember what somebody looks like. But the way that you make that decision and the confidence that you feel like you need to have before you make an identification is affected by your bias and even how much you stereotype Black people, for example, for being like a criminal group implicitly. So there's a lot going on here, and I can talk more another time about the strategies we can use to help make that a little less likely, but that's kind of a long story. And I've already told the long story. So this is all important because this kind of quirk of our memory processing, it leads to real outcomes for people, real bad outcomes. So the Innocence Project you may be familiar with, that looks at cases where there may have been problems with the evidence or problematic convictions. And the Innocence Project estimates that eyewitness misidentification, so making a mistake that's in saying that somebody committed a crime when they did not, is a problem in 3/4 of convictions that are overturned by DNA testing. So eyewitness misidentification is a really big problem that can lead to real consequences, imprisonment, fines, and in the worst cases, even execution might have to do with people misidentifying witnesses. And in the cases where they know the races of both people involved, the victim and the convicted person, cross-race identification happens in most of these instances at a disproportionate level. So just another example of how racial bias can kind of infect the different processes that we're involved in. So again, I just like to start out this memory unit by really trying to drive home how important some of these processes can be and how it might be affected by unexpected types of biases. So with that, why don't we turn to actually talking about the nuts and bolts of the topic at hand. Let's talk about memory. So we can think about a couple different ways we might define memory. And, like usual, there are a lot of ways you can do it. Some of them, they all have pros and cons, and now you'll explain it. But in general, memory is your retention of information, how you are holding on to the facts and knowledge that you have learned. But you might also think about it in a little more complex way, where you include how you can recover information, how you call up those memories, which that first definition doesn't necessarily say. So some might refer to memory as our capacity to preserve and then recover that information. So both storage and access, basically. And there are important separate processes that contribute to memory. So first of which, encoding is how memories are formed. So if we stick with the kind of eyewitness identification piece of it, let's say you are the victim of a crime and you are seeing the person that perpetrated that crime against you, maybe an assault or a mugging or something. When you see that person, you are encoding their face. You are paying attention to some aspects of it, and you are committing that eventually, hopefully, you're intending to your long-term memory. And again, that encoding process might be influenced by racial stereotypes in some ways, where you're paying attention to perhaps someone's eyes or nose or their hair in a way that is like influenced by your racial expectations. So the encoding process, again, can be influenced by those things. But encoding is forming those memories and perceiving that information. storage is what it sounds like, how memories are kept in your brain over time, how the different patterns of neural activation are maintained and sometimes, practiced and rehearsed, depending on what kind of memory we're talking about. Then retrieval is when we recover those memories and put them into a usable format for our, answering a question or performing a task, whatever we need to use that stored knowledge to do. So memory can be much more complex than you might expect. You're forming the memories, you're storing the information, and you are recovering and using the information. There are also a lot of different distinctions that I'm going to make about different types of memory. So I'm going to start with more basic ones that have to do with just remembering, mostly aspects of your environment and what's going on around you, basically. And then we'll start talking about slightly more abstract things that you can remember. So starting out again with the more kind of basic knowledge of your world type things, sensory memory is you trying to make a replica of the environmental messages that you are getting. And your body, your brain rather, well, I mean, your whole body is involved, is constantly making these sorts of snapshots of the world. So remember sensation, this way that we take environmental stimuli and transduce it into something that our brain can use. Your brain is kind of making moment to moment little copies of what you're sensing in the world so you can use it for in the present, basically. But there are different aspects of this sensory memory. So iconic memory, for example, is the visual sensory memories. The fact that if you look at something and then close your eyes right away, you still have a sense of what was there. And that is your iconic memory persevering after you've cut off that sensation from your eyes. Another way maybe to explain this is if you've ever used like a sparkler, in the summer or something, and somebody's waving it around, and you see that trail of the sparkler, that is your iconic memory kind of lasting there. It's you being able to see where something was, the trail of that sparkler, or like flashlight or glow stick or something. So there are the different types of sensory memory. Of course, there's also echoic memory that has to do with your hearing and the sounds that you're encountering in the world. And we'll talk about that one a little more specifically when we get to working memory too. But this is, again, echoic memory. Think of like an echo is sound, and then like an icon, something you can look at, basically. That's helpful to remember those, hopefully. And then one that's maybe a word that you use less, haptic memory. This is more about the physical, tactile things that you can come in contact with in the world. So things like if something feels smooth or rough, or how it feels to be walking up a hill versus walking down a hill. These different types of physical experiences that we might have related more to our sense of touch, and things like balance and equilibrium and how your body is positioned and things like that. So even thinking about sensory memory, which is a relatively straightforward aspect of memory, it can be broken down into these specific pieces, and they're all separate in some ways because you're using different sensory systems to create those messages for your brain. Okay, in the next video, I'm going to start out with a little demonstration of how some of these systems work.